The boy was already gone from the window when the Riggs came through the second time, and that absence said more than any shout could have. Every man in the formation felt it before a single brake was touched. The small square of glass on the second floor of the gray house had held a hand every morning for 11 weeks, a thin arm lifted in a wave that asked for nothing and expected nothing back. Now the glass held only the dull gleam of a curtain pulled crooked, and behind it a darkness that had not been there before. Diesel rumbled low along the cracked frontage road. 12 engines idled in a loose column under a sky the color of wet ash. And the man at the front, the one with the gray beard and the patch that read President over a snarling skull, lifted one gloved hand and brought the whole line to a stop. He did not know the boy's name yet. He only knew the wave. His name was Walter Brandt, and the men who rode behind him called him Deacon, a name earned across 30 years of speaking, last and meaning every word. He sat astride a road-worn machine with chrome, gone soft from 1,000 mornings of weather, and he stared at the window the way a man stares at a chair, gone suddenly empty at a table. Beside him the engines coughed and settled. Nobody spoke. The silence in a column of bikers is its own language, and right now it was asking the same question Deacon was asking himself. Where was the kid? To understand why a dozen hard men stopped their morning ride for an empty window, you have to go back to the first time the hand appeared. It had been a Tuesday in early spring, gray and unremarkable, the kind of morning that forgets itself by noon. The chapter rode the frontage road every day at 7 because it was the cleanest stretch left in a town that had let most of itself go to rust. The old textile mill sat hollow at the end of it, windows gone, and around it the houses leaned in their lots like tired animals. The gray two-story was the worst of them, paint peeling in long curls, a chain-link fence sagging at the gate. A county placard in the yard meant it was a licensed home, one of the houses where the state set down the children nobody else would take. That first Tuesday, a boy had stood in the upstairs window and watched the bikes pass, and on impulse, or out of some loneliness too large for his small frame, he had raised a hand. Most men would have missed it. Deacon did not miss things. He saw the pale hand, the thin wrist, the way the boy ducked back the instant he was seen, as if a wave were a thing he could be punished for. Deacon rode on. The next morning he watched the window without meaning to, and the hand was there again, braver this time, held up a half-second longer. He lifted 2 fingers off the grip in answer. The boy's whole body changed, even from the road, even at speed. Deacon saw the shoulders come up and the face split into something that had been folded away a long time. That night at the clubhouse, Razor had asked him why he did it. The two of them had been the last men awake, the neon over the bar buzzing its low electric hum, the smell of stale coffee and old leather thick in the dim room. Deacon had turned his cup in his hands a long moment before he answered. He said that he had been a boy in a house once, where nobody looked up when he came into a room, and that he had taught himself to stop coming into rooms, and that it had taken him 40 years to learn the cost of a child who teaches himself to disappear. Razor had not said anything to that. He had only refilled both cups and looked at the steel door, and the next morning Razor's hand had come off his own grip a half-second before Deacon's did. After that it became a thing that simply was. Every morning the boy waited in the glass, and every morning the column lifted hands as it passed. 12 riders in rough unison, a small ceremony performed at 30 miles an hour. They learned the rhythm of him without ever meaning to. Some mornings he was already at the window when they came around the bend, his hand up before they cleared the mill. And those were the good mornings, and the men could tell the difference even if they never said so. Some mornings the hand came late and low, and on those mornings the column rode a little quieter the rest of the way in, each man carrying a thought he did not speak. They never stopped. They never spoke to him. They did not know his name or his story, or what kept him on the second floor of that gray house, and by the unspoken rules of men like these it was none of their concern. A wave was just a wave, except a man named Cole Renner had taken to watching the same window. Renner ran the county's placement office, a soft-handed man with a politician's smile and a desk full of forms that turned children into line items and line items into checks. The gray house was his, in the way that mattered. He had signed the license, he had set the rate, he drew a fee for every cot filled under that sagging roof, and the woman who ran it for him asked no questions because questions were bad for the arrangement. Renner drove a clean sedan down the frontage road most weeks to count heads and protect his numbers, and on 3 of those mornings he had seen the bikes lift their hands at the gray house's upstairs glass. It bothered him, in a way he could not name at first. Attention bothered him. Attention was the one thing his arrangement could not survive. The boy in the window was 9 years old, and his name was Toby Hale. He had come to the gray house in the dead of winter, with a paper bag of clothes and a library card that no longer worked, and the woman who ran the place, a thin shape named Mrs. Pruitt, had told him the rules on the first night. The rules were mostly about doors, which doors stayed shut, which stayed locked, when you ate and when you did not. Toby was good at rules. He had learned in 4 homes before this one that rules were how you stayed small enough to be overlooked, and being overlooked was how you stayed safe. He had stopped, expecting to be seen. The room he slept in held 4 cots and a single window, and the window was his. He had claimed it the way a child claims the only good thing in a place, quietly and completely. And the other children in the house had let him because none of them had the heart to fight over a square of cold glass. From it he could see the frontage road, the dead mill, the long, gray nothing of a town that had stopped expecting anything good. He used to count cars to fall asleep. Then there were not enough cars to count, and he started counting the cracks in the ceiling instead, and that was the kind of arithmetic that taught a boy how alone he was. Then the bikes came. He had not meant to wave that first morning. His hand went up on its own, the way a plant turns toward a window, and the terror that followed it was immediate and physical. A cold drop through his chest, because in every house he had ever known, being noticed was the beginning of something bad. He had pulled back fast. He had waited for the consequence. None came. And the next morning 2 fingers had lifted off a handlebar just for him, and Toby Hale had felt something he did not have a word for, a warmth that lived just under the ribs, the simple, unreasoning knowledge that for 1/2 second each day, a group of the largest and most frightening men he had ever seen had decided he was worth a hand raised in the cold. He started waking before his alarm. He started counting the days by the sound of engines. He learned the engines the way other children learned songs. The low building rumble that came up out of the south before the bikes ever cleared the bend, the way it filled the whole gray room and rattled the loose pane under his palm. He would be at the glass 2 full minutes early, breath fogging the cold, watching the empty road for the first flash of chrome. It was the only appointment he kept that no one could cancel. It was the only proof he had that the world contained something that came back. What Toby did not know was that Mrs. Pruitt had noticed too, and had told Renner, because Renner paid her to tell him things. And Renner had decided that a window full of waving and a road full of motorcycles was a complication, and complications got resolved. On the morning the wave did not come, Deacon sat in the road and felt the wrongness of it settle into his gut like cold water. He held the line a full minute. The curtain did not move. A dog barked somewhere behind the mill and went quiet. Then he twisted the throttle and the column rolled on because a man cannot pound on a stranger's door over a missing wave, and because Deacon Brandt had spent his life learning the difference between a feeling and a fact. He turned the column around at the next crossroad and rode back slow, and that was not nothing. The second pass told him more. The gate that had always sagged open now wore a shiny new padlock. A sheet of plywood had been screwed over the lower half of the upstairs window from the inside, so that even if a hand wanted to rise, the glass that held it had been cut in half. And in the gravel drive sat a clean sedan that did not belong to anybody who lived in a house like that. Deacon read all three of these things in the 4 seconds it took to pass, and he filed them the way he filed everything, in silence, behind a face that gave nothing away. He did not stop. Stopping was for when you knew. He rode the chapter back to the clubhouse, a low cinder block building at the edge of the industrial flats, with a steel door and a hand-painted sign, and there, over coffee gone bitter in the pot, he laid it out for the men who needed to hear it. The sergeant-at-arms was a lean man named Eli Vance, called Razor, not for any blade, but for the way he cut a problem down to its bones. He had a single white scar through his left eyebrow and eyes that did not blink much. He listened to Deacon describe the padlock and the plywood and the clean sedan, and when Deacon finished, Razor said one thing. Somebody decided the boy shouldn't wave. "Yeah," Deacon said, "that tells us he matters to somebody. The wrong kind of somebody." Around the scarred bar table, the rest of them had gone still. There was a young member at the end, barely more than a prospect, a wiry kid named Marcus Lowe, whom everyone called Sparrow because he could not sit still, and because he could pull a thread of information out of a screen the way other men pulled a cork from a bottle. Sparrow had a laptop open before Deacon had finished talking, and his fingers were already moving. "Gray 2-story, frontage road, county placard," Sparrow said. "Licensed child placement. Want me to find out who holds the paper?" Deacon looked at the steel door a long moment. He was a careful man, and he knew the line they were near. They were a motorcycle club, not a police force, and the world was full of children behind windows they could do nothing about. Yet he had lifted his hand to that boy 11 weeks running, and a raised hand was a small contract, and Deacon Brandt did not break contracts, however small. "Find out," he said. "Quiet. We're not deciding anything yet. We're just looking." Sparrow looked. What he found over the next 2 days came in pieces, the way the truth always does. The license on the Gray house belonged to a shell with a clean name and a registered agent who turned out to be a paralegal in Cole Renner's county office. The per-child reimbursement rate the home claimed was higher than its conditions could possibly justify. There were 9 children registered to a house with beds for 5. And cross-referenced against the county's own public meeting minutes, which any citizen could pull and almost none ever did, Cole Renner sat on the very oversight board that was supposed to inspect the homes he profited from. He approved his own conditions. He signed off on his own numbers. He had built a closed loop with a child at the center of it, and he had run it for 6 years without a single hand raised against him, because the only people who could see inside it were too small to be believed. Sparrow read the numbers aloud as they surfaced, his voice flat with the particular anger of a young man who has just learned how the world actually works. 9 children, 5 beds. Rates billed at the level of a home with a nurse on staff, and a fenced yard and 3 hot meals, paid out against a house with a chain-link fence and a woman who locked the pantry. He pulled up a satellite image of the gray house and turned the laptop so the others could see the sagging roofline, the dead grass, the plywood already going up over the window in the most recent county photo. "He's not breaking the law," Sparrow said, scrolling. "He wrote the law. That's the trick of it. Every form is signed. Every box is checked. He inspects himself and gives himself a passing grade and cashes the difference. You could hand this to the county tomorrow and they'd file it under his own name and shred it by Friday." Razor leaned over the table and looked at the screen for a long moment. He did not understand the half of it the way Sparrow did, but he understood the shape of a thing built to never be looked at, because he had spent a life looking at exactly such things. "How many homes?" Razor said. "3 that I've found." Sparrow's jaw tightened. "Maybe more. Same shell pattern, same agent, same board signing off. How many kids?" Sparrow did the arithmetic and did not like the answer. Across all 3, on paper, more than 20. In real beds, a lot fewer. The difference is the money. Deacon stood at the window of the clubhouse with a cup going cold in his fist and said nothing for a long while. Outside, the bikes sat in their row, chrome dull under a flat sky. He was thinking about the plywood screwed over the bottom half of the glass. He was thinking that a man who would cut a boy's window in half to stop a wave was a man who had a great deal to hide, and that fear made people careless. "He saw us wave," Deacon said finally. "That's why he covered the window. We spooked him." "So we're the problem," Razor said. "No." Deacon turned from the glass. "We're the reason he moved. And a man who moves leaves tracks. They could have ridden down there that night. 12 engines in the dark, a steel toe to a flimsy door, the woman Pruitt babbling, and Renner's whole rotten arrangement scattered across the gravel. It would have felt good for about an hour. Deacon had seen what felt good for an hour cost men 10 years. And worse, it would have put Toby Hale in the back of a county van and into the next gray house down the road, and the loop would have closed again behind him with a different child at its center. Deacon had not lived as long as he had by mistaking noise for victory. "We don't touch the house," he said. "We don't touch the man. Not with hands." Razor's jaw worked. "Then with what? With everything he's been counting on. Nobody's seeing." Deacon set the cup down. "Sparrow, everything you found. I want it clean. I want it true. And I want it in a form a stranger can understand in 5 minutes. Then we find out who in this county still answers a phone honestly." It took 11 days, and they were the longest 11 days of Toby Hale's small life, because the bikes did not stop coming, but he could no longer see them. The plywood had taken the road from him. He could hear the engines, faint, and then full, and then fading, every morning at 7, and he would press his palm flat against the lower board where the glass used to be, as if the wood might somehow carry the wave through to the men on the other side. He did not know they had seen the boarded window. He did not know they had turned around. He only knew that the one good appointment of his day had been taken from him the way good things were always taken, quietly and without explanation, and that he was expected not to ask. He found a way to live with the wood. There was a half-inch where the board did not quite meet the frame, a thin seam of gray light, and if he pressed his cheek hard against the cold wall and closed one eye, he could see a narrow ribbon of the road. It was not enough to see the bikes. It was almost enough. Every morning he took up his post against the wall and put his eye to the seam and listened, and the listening became its own kind of waving, a thing he did with his whole held breath, and no one in the house knew he did it, because Toby Hale had spent his whole life learning to knead things quietly. Mrs. Pruitt had grown nervous in those 11 days, and a nervous adult in that house meant the rules got stricter. The pantry stayed locked through lunch. The children were kept upstairs. Mrs. Pruitt moved through the halls with her arms wrapped around herself, listening. The way a person listens who has been told that something is coming and has not been told what. Renner came twice. Toby heard the clean car on the gravel and learned to be a shape against a wall. The second time Renner came, he climbed the stairs and stood in the doorway of the room where the children were kept, a soft man in a pressed shirt, and he looked at each of them with the flat, counting gaze of a man checking inventory. His eye stopped on Toby a half-second longer than the rest. Toby felt that gaze the way he had felt the cold drop in his chest the first morning he waved, and he understood. In the wordless way children understand the weather of the adults around them, that the man in the doorway knew about the window, that the man in the doorway was the reason for the wood. "This one," Renner said to Pruitt, not unkindly, which was somehow worse. "Maybe we move this one. Give him a change of scenery." He did not finish the thought aloud. He did not have to. The threat hung in the air of that small room like the smell of the mill, and Toby Hale, 9 years old and good at rules, understood that he was about to be made to disappear into the next house down the line, and that there was nothing in the world a boy his size could do about it. He lay awake that night, counting the cracks in the ceiling, the way he had before the bikes came, and he made himself a small, hard promise, the only kind a child in his place can make. He would put his eye to the seam in the morning. He would listen for the engines. Whatever house they moved him to, he would find a window, and he would wave at whatever passed, because the waving was the one thing they had not been able to lock. He was wrong about being moved. He just did not know it yet. Because, while Toby pressed his hand against the plywood, Sparrow's quiet work had become a thing with weight. He had pulled 6 years of county reimbursement records, all of them public if you knew the request to file. He had matched them against inspection reports signed by a board on which Renner sat. He had found a second home, and a third. The same shell names, the same inflated rates, the same impossible bed counts. He had found the paralegal who was the registered agent, and with nothing more than patience and a public bar association directory, a paper trail that put her in Renner's office, none of it was a gun. All of it was true. And true, assembled into one clean stack. A stranger could read in 5 minutes, was the only weapon Deacon had ever fully trusted. The trouble was who you handed it to. Deacon had been right, that the local board was Renner's. The county had spent 6 years not seeing what was in plain sight, because the man profiting from the blindness was the man holding the lamp. A stack of records handed to the wrong desk would be buried by lunch, and Toby Hale would be in a van by dinner. So Deacon did not hand it to a desk. He spent 2 of those 11 days on the phone, in the slow, careful way of a man calling in markers 30 years old, and he found the people the loop had not been built to survive. A reporter, 2 counties over, who had written about foster placement fraud once and been told there was no story. A retired investigator from the state's own oversight office, a woman who had left in disgust years back and still kept her files. And last, a sitting member of the state legislature, whose own brother had aged out of the same broken system and who had been waiting most of a career for someone to put real paper in his hands. The reporter took the most convincing because she had been burned before and had learned to flinch from a tip the way a beaten dog flinches from a raised hand. Deacon did not push. He gave her the document request numbers and told her to pull the records herself, so that nothing she printed would ever depend on taking an old biker's word for anything. She called him back the next afternoon, and her voice had changed, and she said only that she had spent 11 years in this work and had never seen a thing sit so plainly, in public view, that no one had bothered to add up. He told her the adding up was the whole of it. He told her he was not the story and did not want to be, and that if his name appeared anywhere near it, he would deny he had ever called. She understood. People in her work understood that kind of arrangement better than most. The retired investigator was easier because she had been waiting. She had left the oversight office 6 years back. The same year, Renner took his board seat, and she had always believed the two things were connected without ever being able to prove it. When Deacon laid out the shell names and the bed counts, she went quiet on the line for a long moment, and then she said she had a banker's box in her garage, with half of it already inside, and that she would drive it down herself. She did not ask why a motorcycle club was the one finally making this call. In 30 years, she had learned that justice arrives in whatever vehicle is willing to carry it, and she had stopped being particular about the paint. Deacon did not ask any of them for a favor. He told them what was true, gave them where to look, and let the records do the rest. That was the whole of it. Men like Renner believed that power was the thing you held over others. Deacon understood that power was mostly the absence of light, and that you did not have to strike a man who lived in the dark. You only had to open the door. On the 12th morning, the chapter rode the frontage road at 7, the way it always had. The plywood was still over the lower half of the window. That morning, though, parked at the sagging gate, were two vehicles that did not belong to a forgotten house at the end of a forgotten road. A plain state car, and a second car, unmarked, with a woman in it who had spent her career learning to read a place by the cars in its drive. Deacon slowed the column to a crawl as he passed, and he saw the front door of the gray house standing open, and Mrs. Pruitt on the step, with her arms wrapped around herself, and beyond her, in the dim of the hall, the soft, pale shape of Cole Renner, who had driven down to manage the complication personally and had walked into the one morning he could not manage at all. Deacon did not stop. He had learned long ago that the most powerful thing a man can do is be seen leaving while the trap he set is still closing. He lifted 2 fingers off the grip, the old wave aimed at a window he could no longer see through. On the chance the boy was behind it, he was. Toby had heard the engines and pressed his hand to the wood, and through the half-inch of gap where the plywood did not quite meet the frame, he had seen the smallest sliver of the road. He had seen the chrome. He had seen, for 1/2 second, 2 gloved fingers lift in the gray morning air. And Toby Hale, who had taught himself not to expect to be seen, understood that he had been seen all along. What happened to Cole Renner did not happen with a fist, which is what makes it the kind of thing men in clubhouses tell each other late at night with a quiet that is almost reverence. It happened with paper, and with light, and with the slow, terrible weight of his own arrangement, turned inside out in front of people he could not buy. The retired investigator had brought her files. The reporter had spent 11 days making calls of her own, and had a story half-written before she ever set foot on the frontage road, a story with names and rates and bed counts, and a photograph of a window with its lower half boarded over from the inside. The legislator had made one call to the state's placement authority, the real one, the one Renner did not sit on, and that call had moved with the speed that only comes when a powerful person finally decides to spend his power on something true. The plain state car in the drive belonged to an emergency removal team with the authority to take every child out of that house and into real homes by nightfall, and the authority, more importantly, to ask Cole Renner the one question his whole career had been built on, never being asked. Where does the money go? He did not have an answer that survived daylight. Men like him never do. The smile he wore into county meetings curdled the moment the investigator opened the first folder on the hood of her car, and by the time the reporter's photographer stepped out to document the boarded window, Cole Renner had stopped being a man who managed complications and become the complication itself. He reached, once, for the phone in his pocket, for the board members and the favors and the soft loop of protection he had spent 6 years weaving. He got as far as a name before he understood that the loop had been cut, that the people on the other end of those numbers were already reading their own copies of the same clean stack, and that every one of them was now far more interested in being seen far away from him than in taking his call. The state team went into the house. The children came out, 9 of them into the gray morning light, blinking, each one carrying a bag, and the last one out was a thin boy of 9 who stopped on the step and looked down the empty frontage road as if waiting for something. The bikes were already gone. That was the part Deacon had judged exactly right. He had not wanted Toby's rescue to wear leather and chrome, because a boy saved by frightening men would only learn that he needed frightening men, and Deacon wanted the boy to learn that he had been worth saving the ordinary way by the world finally working the way it was supposed to. So the chapter had passed and ridden on, and the cars in the drive belonged to people with badges and notepads, and from the outside it looked like the system had simply, for once, done its job. Deacon had left one thing behind, though. He had given the retired investigator a single instruction, the only personal thing he asked in 11 days of asking nothing. When the boy comes out, he had said, "Tell him the men on the bikes saw the wave. Tell him they always saw it. And tell him they said he can stop waving now, because waving is what you do at people who are passing by, and they are not passing by anymore." The investigator was a hard woman who had seen the worst the system could do to a child, and she had not cried at work in 15 years. She crouched down on the gravel in front of the thin boy with the paper bag, and she gave him the message word for word. And Toby Hale's face did the thing Deacon had seen from the road on the second morning, the folding away coming undone, and the woman had to look at the mill for a moment before she could stand back up. The story ran 4 days later, 2 counties wide and then wider. Cole Renner's name was in the headline. The bed counts were in the 3rd paragraph, and the reimbursement rates were in a chart anyone could read. The board that had protected him spent a frantic week protecting itself instead, which meant cutting him loose, which they did with the speed of men throwing ballast from a sinking basket. The shell homes were shut. The arrangement that had run 6 years in the dark did not survive 6 days in the light. Renner was not led away in chains that week, because paper moves slower than that, but he was finished in every way that had ever mattered to him. Stripped of the office and the board seat and the soft circle of people who had returned his calls, he drove out of the county on a bright, flat afternoon, with the sun coming hard off the hood of his clean sedan, into a daylight that no longer held a single door he could hide behind. And the men who tell this story late at night always pause here, because there is a kind of justice that needs no fist. And they saw it done. Toby Hale went to a home on the other side of the county, a real one, with a married couple who had wanted a child for a long time, and a kitchen that smelled like bread on Sundays. It was a quiet street, with no frontage road and no mill and no bikes at 7 in the morning, and for a while Toby missed the engines with an ache he did not have words for, the way you miss a thing that taught you that you existed. He need not have, because Deacon Brandt was a man who kept contracts, and a wave was a contract, and a contract did not end just because the window did. It was Razor who found out where the boy had landed, quietly, the same way Sparrow found everything. And it was Deacon who decided what to do with it, which was almost nothing, which was exactly the right amount. They did not descend on the quiet street in a column of 12. They did not frighten the kind couple or make a spectacle that would mark the boy as the one the bikers came for. Instead, one Saturday in early summer, a single rider came down the quiet street at an easy pace, an old man with a gray beard on a road-worn machine, and he slowed as he passed the house with the bread-smell kitchen, and a boy who happened to be sitting on the front step looked up. Deacon lifted 2 fingers off the grip. Toby Hale was on his feet before he knew he had moved, and his hand went up, and this time there was no cold drop in his chest, no terror chasing the wave, no waiting for the consequence. There was only a boy on a step in the sun raising his hand to a man who had seen him from the very first morning, and a man on a bike lifting 2 fingers in return, the smallest possible gesture, carrying the largest possible thing. Deacon did not stop. He did not need to. He rode on to the end of the quiet street and turned and was gone. And that was the whole of it, and it was everything. After that, the rider came most Saturdays. Sometimes there were 2. By the end of that summer, the kind couple had met the old man with a gray beard over coffee at their kitchen table, and had learned, in the partial way these men ever explained themselves, that their boy had a standing arrangement with a motorcycle club he had never formally met, an open contract written in raised hands on cold mornings, and that the arrangement was not a thing they intended to break. The couple was wise enough to be grateful and not afraid. They understood that their son had been seen once, when no one else was looking, by men who had decided he was worth a hand raised in the cold, and that some debts are paid not in a single grand gesture, but in a small one, repeated for as long as it takes. Toby Hale grew up on the quiet street. He did well, the way children do when they finally believe they will be allowed to. He learned that the world had cars with badges and people with notepads and an arrangement somewhere that had failed him, and then finally had not. The thing he carried, though, the thing that sat warm under his ribs for the rest of his life, was smaller and older than any of that. It was the memory of a gray morning and a half-inch of gap in a sheet of plywood, and through it 2 gloved fingers lifting off a handlebar for him when he had taught himself to expect nothing at all. Years later, grown and steady, he would tell the story to his own children on a Saturday with bread in the oven, and when he got to the part about the empty window, the part where the whole chapter stopped in the road for a wave that did not come, his voice would go quiet the way the men in the clubhouse went quiet, because some things are too large to say loudly. He would tell them that the largest men he ever knew had decided to see the smallest person nobody else would, and that they had not saved him with their fists, which they had, but with their patience, which was harder, and with the simple refusal to let a raised hand go unanswered. And on the quiet street, on the right kind of Saturday, you could still sometimes hear a single engine come down at an easy pace and slow at one particular house, and a hand would rise on the step to meet 2 fingers lifting off a grip, and the morning would smell like warm bread and cut grass and the faint, clean bite of exhaust, and it would smell Mon more than anything, like a boy who had finally been allowed to stop being afraid of being seen. If this story moved you, if you felt that warmth under your own ribs for a boy who only ever wanted a hand raised in the cold, take a moment to leave a comment, give it a like, and subscribe so that the next person who needs to hear that the smallest among us are worth stopping for can find their way to it too. Thank you for riding this one out with us.